Hello there.
Welcome back to part 3 of Get Over It, NASA landed on the moon. Today, I just want to share 10 things that confirm in my mind that faking the moon landings would have been impossible. Reason number 1, the Soviets. Now, as you can probably imagine, since the Soviets were the main rivals in the space race, and there were actual tensions from the Cold War, if the Soviets could have proven that the moon landings were hoaxed, they probably would have, given that they were struggling to do it themselves. Now, something I wondered about was why did the Soviets never put a man on the moon anyway, even after America did? And it turns out that there are 4 key reasons behind this. The first reason is that their N1 rocket, which was designed to compete with the Saturn V, failed all 4 of its test launches. Their third launch of the N1 rocket in 1969 actually destroyed the entire launch pad and the facility. And that explosion in particular is still considered one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. So that's gonna set you back a little bit. But other than that, there were a couple of other big problems as well. The second reason they never put somebody on the moon was that in 1966, their chief rocket engineer, Sergei Korolev, died unexpectedly. I suppose you could consider this the equivalent of Werner von Braun from NASA dying. But Sergei's death led to a bit of disorganization and poor management, and probably the 4 explosions of the N1 rocket on the launch pad. The third reason, and this is probably the most important one, is that they never had the funding or the resources that NASA did. And this is mostly because they had a much smaller economy than America did. And the fourth reason is that after the US landed on the moon, the political impetus for a Soviet moon mission evaporated. The Soviet Union then decided to focus on developing space stations, notably at the time, the Salyut program, which paved the way for the MIR and the International Space Station. Now, with that all said, I think it stands to reason that if they could have proven that NASA did fake the moon landings, there would have still been a motive for them to try to land somebody on the moon. Now, the next question is, how do we know that they know that NASA did actually achieve this? Well, the Soviets admitted that they tracked Apollo 11. And here's something that's really heartwarming actually. Yuri Gagarin, first man to ever go into space, admitted that they were hoping that the Americans achieved this. They were hoping that Neil, Buzz and Mike didn't die. Sir Yuri Gagarin, what a fucking legend, has just earned the historian's pap of approval. Anyways, not only did the Soviets track them, other ham radio operators in the UK as well as people all over the world tracked Apollo 11. And Apollo 11 was constantly sending out radio signals, proving that something at least was on its way to the moon. The thing is though, there were people all over the world tracking where these signals were coming from, and nobody was able to say that these signals originated from Earth. Therefore, if this mission was pre-recorded and then put into the space shuttle and then sent to the moon and then it broadcasted the signals back down to Earth, then how the fuck can you explain Richard Nixon's phone call? This phone call was recorded live on both ends. So if it was pre-recorded, Richard Nixon and the astronauts, who are not actors, would have to re-act that entire phone call the exact same way again. But the biggest problem, of course, is that if these signals were then recorded live at the time on Earth, then sent up to the moon to be broadcast back down to Earth, how did the Soviets or any radio operator in the world miss that? The only answer to that question is that Apollo 11 landed on the moon and then they broadcast the signal back down to Earth because they landed on the moon. And this is where we get to the really funny shit now. So Green Coats claim that the Soviets tracked Apollo, but they knew that NASA was hoaxing the moon landings, so they blackmailed them for technology. Technology that was apparently inferior because they could not send people to the moon. So in part 2, we went over all the things that the Soviets had done just prior to NASA doing them as well. Sending people into space, sending animals into space, landing things on the moon softly and crashing them. They were obviously more or less in the same place with their technology. And I suppose that an argument could be made that the Soviets were then arguably ahead of NASA. So then why in the blue hell would they blackmail them for technology that was either the same or inferior to theirs? That also led nowhere, by the way, because all of their rockets blew up on the launch pad, so they cancelled their moon missions. So yeah, that's a very weird claim, but There's always a 0% chance that that could be true. So why has nobody from the Soviet Union or Russia ever come forward with this information then? There is always a whistleblower for everything, but somehow the Soviets and Russia have kept this secret for as long as NASA have. As is tradition, somebody somewhere would have found this out and tried to make money from this information. Can you imagine how big of a fucking story that would be if somebody could come out and prove it? It's already a massive conspiracy in spite of the fact that no one can prove this didn't happen. So this idea that the Soviets were blackmailing NASA for technology, and only God knows what the radio operators were blackmailing NASA for, but this idea is fucking ridiculous. The Soviets had every reason in the world to expose NASA, and all they ever said to them was congratulations. So in honor of Neil Armstrong, that is a 13 out of 10 irrefutable fact. Reason number 2, it would be impossible to keep a secret like this. If you believe that the moon landings were faked, then you have to believe that NASA, the US government, the 12 astronauts who walked on the moon, the 6 astronauts orbiting the moon in the command module, the 3 astronauts who had to abort the mission, and the 400,000 people in total involved in the Apollo program, all of their friends and family, and the 20,000 plus industrial firms involved in building various different parts for the Apollo program, all lied and managed to keep it a secret all this time. Moses, what an accomplishment. Now what doesn't make sense to me is that green coats say not everybody would have had to have known that this was a hoax, and the rest of the people were actually just building a rocket and planned a mission to the moon that very much had the capability of putting a person on the moon. So just a small little handful of people had to know that this was bullshit. Fair enough. Let's assume just for fun that it was a small group of people. How small a group would this have been? Well, you have the people who came to build the film set, who rigged the wires, built all the props and the rocks for the movie, and all the companies and contractors and salespeople that you had to contact to get all the sand, to get all the parts and metals and get all the props built for this movie set. The people who had to probably build this big vacuum-sealed structure as well. The people who filmed it, directed it, and lit the set. And then all the people had to come and destroy this vacuum-sealed film set and hide all of the evidence as well. And then, of course, you've got the Soviets who are blackmailing you for your inferior technology. So you're trying to keep them quiet. Then you've got all the ham radio operators in the world blackmailing you for fuck knows what, and you're trying to keep them quiet too. And then you also have everyone at Mission Control who was monitoring everything live as they helped the astronauts navigate to the moon. As well as the astronauts themselves, their friends and their families too. And oh my god, the list continues. The numerous labs around the world who examined the lunar samples brought back by Apollo 11 had to know that this was all fake as well so that they could lie about the lunar samples that they studied. So I'm just going to stop here. I know I've missed a lot of people too, but that already is a shit ton of people. And honestly, it's even more amazing than landing on the moon in the first place that not one of these people ever came forward and said all this moon shit is a giant lie. In my opinion, no matter what way you want to swing this idea, there will always still be a bunch of people who had to know it was fake. And no one has ever leaked information that has proven that. Can you imagine how fucking hard that would be to have that many people keep a secret? People can't even keep themselves from leaking spoilers for TV shows or those fucking Marvel movies that nobody cares about anymore. I mean, even WWE gets spoiled. People were saying that John Cena was going to retire by tapping out to Gunther weeks before it even happened. People even said the same thing about AJ Styles. He was going to retire to Gunther at the Royal Rumble weeks before it even happened. And that's fucking wrestling. So do you really think that not a single person involved, one way or another in the Apollo program, ever let slip that it was all bullshit? You must be out of your crayon-chewing fucking mind if you think that. I find it so hilarious that people think this shit, man. You know what we should do? We should ask these people who come up with all of these ideas to write for Marvel. Maybe the movies would be better. They would be more creative for sure. Now, I just want to add something here before somebody says, well, Bill Casey came out and said something. Yes, he did. He worked at Rocketdyne and he left Rocketdyne in 1963. 6 years before Apollo 11 landed on the moon. If he had said something before he left Rocketdyne, then I would say that still doesn't prove anything. But fair dinkum to him then. But Bill Casing never came out and said anything until about 7 years after Apollo 11 landed on the moon. But the fact is, he would need to have presented some kind of physical proof that could be tied back to NASA, Rocketdyne, the Pentagon, anyone or anything at all, other than just what he said in his shitty book. He claimed that he saw a memo. He could have photocopied that memo and used that as evidence. But he didn't, because as we all know, he got this idea from a homeless heroin addict who said write something that undermines the government. Anyway, I decided to read a bit more about Bill Casing, and I came across this quote from clavius.org. So somebody made this point about Bill Casing. Quote, Bill Casing had a security clearance. If anyone would have known about the conspiracy, he would. And I thought only a few people had to know. Anyway, Clavius responds, quote, if so, then why does he not simply say, there was a conspiracy and I was in on it? Instead, he, like all other conspiracists, must nitpick at details and construct a complicated conjectural case against NASA. Security clearances were routinely required for anyone working on rocket booster technology, because that technology was being developed chiefly as a weapon. Clearance would have been required of anyone who had access to the printed material circulating through Rocketdyne, but having access to it doesn't mean Casing necessarily read or understood it. This argument is simply far too indirect to support the notion that Casing was an expert on Rocketdyne's Apollo-related projects. End quote. So yeah, considering the context of the time, there was a general distrust of the government, as well as Bill Casing's own words, writing some shit to undermine the government, as well as the fact that he took so long to say anything, and didn't mention this to anybody when he quit Rocketdyne. He didn't take any evidence with him either. This all just suggests that he took advantage of people's distrust in the government at the time, and sold people a piece of white-hard calcified dog shit. Reason number 3. The lunar samples. In total, about 382 kilograms or 842 pounds of lunar samples were brought back to Earth by all 6 Apollo missions that landed on the moon. Now that's great and all, but where did the first lunar samples come from? Did they come from an unmanned probe that landed on the moon and then launched off again? Well, no, because the first time that happened, it was 1970. But Apollo 11 brought back samples from their mission in 1969. And that has been verified at labs all over the world that have no affiliation or any reason at all to lie for NASA. Now, in part 1, I asked this question. What do you think would be the bigger story here? Scientists confirm that NASA moon rocks are actually moon rocks, or scientists confirm that NASA moon rocks are actually calcified dog shit from Earth. People are naturally drawn to negativity and drama. Now I know there's a story that Bart Sibrel likes to tell about some guy who gave another guy what he said was a moon rock that he got from Neil Armstrong. And then this piece of moon rock turned out to be petrified wood. Wow, what a fucking surprise. There are scammers and liars in the world. The moon rocks that NASA gave out to people are very easily identifiable by the way that they were presented. Here's a photo of the petrified wood, and here's an example of how NASA presented the moon rocks that they gave out. So it's more likely here that somebody was either mistaken or intentionally scammed somebody else here. But to put the blame on NASA for this is fucking weird. But anyway, what do green coats say about the moon rocks? Well, they say that these moon rocks, all 382 kilograms of them, came from Antarctica. Well, you know, they could have if NASA invented time travel. The first lunar meteorites that were ever documented to have been found in Antarctica were only found in 1982. So I don't know, unless NASA had a fucking time machine, how the fuck can the lunar samples from 1969 have come from Antarctica? If you are willing to believe that, but not believe that people went to the moon, just go get a job at Marvel and write movie scripts for them, because they need your imagination. Reason number 4. The photographs. There's really no reason to talk more about the photographic evidence. Just go and look at them. There are thousands to look through, and hundreds of hours of video footage from all of the Apollo missions. None of these photos contradict one another, and if you're gonna fake anything, you're probably gonna fake your golden goose Neil Armstrong on the moon during Apollo 11, which they didn't. Now, since doing part 2 of this series, I have found out that there are actually 2 photos of Neil Armstrong on the moon. Apparently, it's these 2. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, after looking at thousands of Apollo photos, I really don't think that NASA faked any of them. But there is one photo in particular that a lot of grifters and greencoats use as proof that NASA fucks with their photos. And the photo they use is this one. Now, this is Mike Collins while in training. He's in a parabolic plane at the moment here training for space, and this is the photo they use as proof. It's obviously the same photo, so whoever edited it painted out the backgrounds to make it look like an actual photo of Mike Collins on a spacewalk. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you wonder why I always sound like someone just pissed in my cornflakes, unfortunately that's just my natural voice. I'm a brash and blunt South African, but in this case, my cornflakes are overflowing. If the fucking grifters and greencoats who come up with this shit put the same amount of effort in to do some good in the world, we may have already evolved into a hyperversal utopian civilization. Maybe. Probably, I don't know. But man, this photo of Mike Collins is actually from Mike Collins' own book that he wrote called Carrying the Fire. And this photo of Mike Collins is from the same fucking book. So both photos come from the same book. So here's my deduction. In order to have seen both photos, the person who first propagated this as some sort of deception would have had to have owned this book and read it. If they read the book, they would know exactly why this was done, and therefore purposely misled people with their white hard dog shit. Now let me just quickly clarify this. NASA didn't publish this book, and therefore they have nothing to do with this edited photo. Here is what happened. Mike Collins was the captain of a mission called Gemini 10. Now, Gemini 10 was launched in 1966 and was a 3-day Earth orbital mission co-piloted by John Young of Apollo 10 and 16 fame. Now, Gemini 10 had a long list of missions, but most notably, they tried docking with their Regina target vehicle, which they did. They also tried to boost to a record altitude for a crewed spaceflight, and they did, and they got up to an altitude of about 763.8 kilometers. They also did a shitload of different experiments, as well as 2 spacewalks. Now that's quite a lot for 2 guys to do in just 3 days. But they did, because they were professionals. However, according to Mike Collins, quote, "One of the great disappointments of the flight was the fact that there were no photos of my spacewalk," end quote. So in Michael Collins' book, not NASA's book, in Mike's book, he used a photo taken of him while in training in a parabolic plane. The original unedited photo in his book even has this caption, "The 0G aeroplane sickening." The obviously edited photo has no caption. And again, both of these photos only appear in Michael Collins' book. Now I'll admit this is a very good trick, because when I first saw this as well, I was like, wow, that is actually quite weird. But you know, you do the minimum amount of research and you find the answer. So Mike Collins had somebody edit this photo for his book because he had no photos of him walking in space. But sure, it's fucking NASA's fault. Nassholes. Anyways, back to the thousands and thousands of Apollo photos. Now, grifters and greencoats say that they're all fake, and they were shot in a studio, and the proof of this is that the shadows aren't parallel and they converge and they don't line up or whatever. Here's the thing though, if you hear a greencoat say that, you already know that they haven't bothered to look through all the photos. They've probably only seen the 1 or 2 that their greencoat friends have shown them. But perspective is a hard thing to understand, I suppose. And it can turn the most sane individuals into conspiracy theorists.
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil!
Well damn, it seems that I had my own little Mandela effect here. Because I always remembered Anakin saying from my perspective, the Jedi are evil. So I guess from my point of view, Anakin meant perspective.
Well then you are lost!
Moses, who pissed in your cornflakes, Obi-Wan? But you're probably right. Now, a channel that I like to watch in my free time is Corridor Digital, the VFX Artist React people. And they showed a clip of a plane, and I want to ask you as well, how far away do you think this plane is from the actors? You think maybe 10 meters, 100 meters? Do you think maybe 200 meters? Now, I'll tell you how far away the plane is. It's a fucking mile away. But it doesn't look like it, because the camera has a 2000mm lens on it. So the Apollo photos are shot with 70mm lenses. Some of them are shot with 35mm, but most of them are shot with 70mm. You can do the same thing on Earth. You can simulate a 70mm focal length, and you can get the exact same effect here with the shadows. On Earth, which is 6 times larger than the moon. But I get it. Perspective is a hard thing to understand. I mean, just think about it. Why in the blue hell does the road converge at the horizon? Oh my god, it must be NASA's fault. I bet you that NASA is faking what I see with my own eyes in a film studio somewhere, because while I'm driving down the road, I swear to God, the road seems to converge on the horizon, like these shadows in the Apollo photos. Shadows don't do that on Earth. Oh fuck, no wait, they do actually do that on Earth. Fuck. It must be NASA's fault. Can you believe those motherfuckers? They first tell us that the world is a globe, and then when we least expected it, they captured all of us, put us in the Matrix, and they're probably using us as batteries to power their light source in their film studios that's as bright and large and powerful and as far away as the sun. So that they can light up their city-sized moon miniature and accurately fake all of the moon photos. That idea sounds fucking stupid, doesn't it? Because it is stupid. How about this? Let's reach a compromise here. If NASA faked the moon landings, but they're good enough to land their lunar module in the exact spot on the moon to recreate their film set so precisely that when satellites from other countries fly over the moon, those photos perfectly match the photos taken by the astronauts, and picked up their footprints as well, by the way. How the fuck could they have possibly fucked up the shadows? Do you know that NVIDIA themselves, the graphics people, recreated this famous photo of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder to prove that there is no fuckery here? The question has been, why is Buzz lit in the shadow of the lunar lander? Well, because the moon is quite reflective, just like how you see it in the night sky. I don't know if any crayon-tuned conspiracy theorists know this, but the moon is not a fucking light bulb. It is reflecting the sun's light. It reflects light whether or not the astronauts are on it. Did you even know that water can reflect light like this too? Just look at this photo. Or did NASA fake this photo too? Or what about this video of someone throwing a rock into a pond? Did NASA fake that as well? You know, this is not hard to understand, but of course, we choose not to understand because we are starving for attention.
We are famished. Yes, famished we are, precious.
Next up is the stars. Where are they? Well, it's the fucking day on the moon, by the way. But also, did you know that the astronauts didn't go to the moon to take photos of the stars? They went to the moon to take photos of the moon! However, the fact that the stars are absent in most space-related media is something that even a noob photographer understands. When the astronauts went to the moon with their specially designed Hasselblad cameras for the mission, the settings used were designed to capture the astronauts on the moon's surface. The fact that the stars are not visible is just basic photography. According to astronomy.com, quote, "Generally speaking, the brighter the target object, the smaller the aperture and faster the shutter. Otherwise, too much light will hit the film, and then the photo will be dominated by a washed out, overexposed focal point. Let's say that you're Neil Armstrong photographing Buzz Aldrin during a bright lunar day. Buzz in his spacesuit and the lunar surface are going to be the brightest objects in your shot. So for him to be visible, you want to choose a fast shutter speed and a smaller aperture. The result is a clear image of Buzz, but other light sources like the stars are too dim to leave an impression on the film. There are some images where you can see the stars in space. Apollo astronauts left the camera shutter open longer during some photographic experiments." End quote. Well, I'll see if I can find one. Don't worry, I've only got to look through a couple thousand photos. But I'm sure that explanation explains why there's no stars. It's the same reason that we can't see stars in the day on Earth. And the same reason as well, when you try to take photos of the stars on your phone, barely any of them come out. Reason number 5. The moon buggy. It only feels right that Sir Charlie Duke, 10th man to walk on the moon, 10th man to ever get the Mastorian's Pap of Approval, deals one of the killing blows to this moon landing shit. You know, after the way he was treated on that podcast. So during Apollo 16, Sir Charlie Duke and John Young founded the Lunar Olympics, and one of the sports was the Lunar Rover Grand Prix. And in doing so, they inadvertently recorded some of the best and most impossible to dismiss evidence, unless you're fucking blind. So scientists, people who get paid to study things, have analyzed this video, and they've mapped the dust trajectory seen in this video, and they've compared it to dust trajectories of that of Earth. And not only does the result plainly state that the dust is not affected by air resistance, because there is no air on the moon, therefore no air resistance, but also the result clearly states that the dust is very obviously and very clearly being affected by 1/6 Earth gravity, i.e. moon gravity. Therefore, the only way this video would have been possible to fake is if this was shot in a vacuum-sealed parabolic plane. Yeah, this video could only be faked by being shot in a vacuum-sealed parabolic plane, which is obviously not possible, which means that this video is real. But anyway, Sir Charlie Duke, what a legend, ending the moon debate once and for all. But of course, greencoats are going to say it's CGI. Yeah, CGI in 1972. It's a good thing they didn't get ILM, one of the best VFX teams in the world, to do it, or the Lunar Rover may have disappeared for one frame. And also, thank God that they didn't hire Weta Digital, the best VFX team in the world, because they fuck up shit too from time to time. Okay, the Thanos gauntlet's very small, but they fucked it up. Or what about the time that Samwise Gamgee was sliding into Mount Doom's DMs? And one more for the road, what about that shit in Thor Love and Thunder? It's amazing. Out of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of Apollo video footage, no fuck up like that's ever been found. Because it's real. Reason number 6. Apollo 18. Now, since we're on the topic of special effects and CGI, have you seen the found footage film Apollo 18? I was like, Moses, so many of the visual effects look so good. It looks like they actually filmed on the moon. Well, it turns out that they actually did use some archival footage from the real missions. And it's pretty easy to spot when they switch between actual Apollo mission footage and their own footage that they shot for the movie. Oh, and by the way, Apollo 18 is a sci-fi movie and completely fictional. I don't know if I'd say it's a good movie or whatever, I'm not much of a reviewer, but I enjoyed the movie. Now, in terms of budget, Apollo 18 cost about $5 million to produce. So it's a massive difference in comparison to NASA's Apollo program, which cost about $250 billion. But CGI has come a long way, and still cannot replicate the look of the actual missions. Reason number 7, Apollo 13. Now this time I'm not talking about the movie, I'm talking about the real mission. In part 2 of this series, I very briefly mentioned this aborted mission. But unsurprisingly, grifters and greencoats use this to fuel their conspiracy theory. Even though this time, NASA admitted they didn't go to the moon because the main oxygen tank in the space shuttle exploded. So they fucking looped around the moon and they came back home. Now, we're gonna need some context to understand how these people can use this mission to fuel the conspiracy theory. And it has a lot to do with, surprise, surprise, attention.
We are famished.
So Apollo 11 had an estimated 600 million people watching live. Some estimates go as high as 650 million. At that time, July 20th, 1969, it was the most viewed live TV broadcast until Princess Diana's wedding, which drew about 750 million people. Now, of course, that was 1981, perhaps more people had TVs, or perhaps more people cared about Princess Diana getting married than people landing on the moon for the first time. I don't really know. However, by the time Apollo 12 happened in November 1969, a mere 4 months after the first landing, people had already stopped giving a shit. They had resigned to the fact that the lunar landings were routine now, so only about half as many people tuned in. Which is still an incredible amount of people, but yeah, only about 300 million. I suppose that it also didn't really help that astronaut Alan Bean accidentally aimed the TV camera at the sun and fucked it up, basically leaving the live feed unusable, so people weren't even able to really watch. Now, this mission was going to try to do a color live feed, but the sun exposure created a permanent, bright, unusable image on the screen, destroying the sensor. So when Apollo 13 came around, public interest in watching the moon landings were at an all-time low. Pretty much like Marvel movies nowadays. But apparently, Apollo 13 only brought in 40 million viewers at its peak. And TV stations, believe it or not, were actually kinda pissed that they had to show Apollo 13 instead of whatever else they were gonna be showing, like soap operas and game shows and shit. And some TV stations didn't even bother showing Apollo 13. But anyway, here comes the galaxy brain idea. NASA faked the Apollo 13 oxygen tank explosion to reinvigorate some public interest. Wow. Unsurprisingly though, this explosion did lead to a massive spike in viewers tuning in. Because as we all know, people love drama, people love controversy, people love a very real shitty situation for some very real astronauts who came really close to dying. Now again, the question must be asked, why in the blue flaming fucking hell would NASA fake something like this? Here's something I didn't know until recently, but NASA didn't make a cent from the live moon broadcasts. These were government-funded public domain events provided freely to broadcasters worldwide. On the other hand though, each of the crewed Apollo missions cost around $25 to $30 billion in today's money. And I'm talking total cost here, I'm talking salaries and materials and all that bullshit combined. So, if NASA deliberately sabotaged their own mission just so people would watch them again, they literally blew $25 billion just to get more viewers, which they did not directly profit from. But NASA did get their fundings from the government. So it did not matter how many people were watching. So sabotaging your own mission to get more people to watch, which you aren't directly profiting from, is not exactly the best idea when successful missions is going to keep getting funded by the government. Well, at least until they realize that Russia isn't trying to land somebody on the moon, so fuck the Apollo program. Anyways, reason number 8. And this one's a little bit petty, but I feel like throwing some more punches. Bart Sibrel's number one piece of evidence that the moon landings were fake actually proved they were real. Now, I'm going to recommend that you watch Dave McKeegan's video on this and how he thoroughly debunks it. But basically, Bart Sibrel suggests that during Apollo 11, while Neil, Buzz and Mike are halfway to the moon, they start broadcasting some footage back to Earth and show what they can see out of the window. Before I continue, I want to show you a quick little clip from Apollo 9. So this is what low Earth orbit looks like. This is where most satellites are, where the ISS is, around about here. But I also want you to notice the shape of the window. And also how big the Earth is, but how can you not notice that? Okay, good. So now you know what this spacecraft looks like. Let's go over to Bart's video.
Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day.
So the basics of it is that Apollo 11 apparently isn't 130,000 miles away from Earth zooming in on the whole thing, but is instead only a few hundred miles away in low Earth orbit, and the command module window has been covered up, apart from a small circular cutout, to create the impression that the Earth is just a small circle in the frame.
On the left, he claims, and this is the part they showed to the public, that that's the Earth floating in space halfway to the moon looking back.
Okay.
And then on the right is the outtakes where the lights come up and you see that the camera's really at the back of the spacecraft, and that's part of the Earth outside of a circular window.
They're using the darkness of the cabin by blocking out all the windows,
and
it makes it look like it's space.
Exactly. It makes it look like the Earth is floating in space. So we have them faking being halfway to the moon, which means they cannot go.
So this is his big claim. He openly accepts that the astronauts are in space, but he says that they're staying in low Earth orbit and faking the appearance of the Earth being really far away by shooting out of a circular window. And he says they had to do this because they couldn't really get beyond low Earth orbit due to the Van Allen belts. How we know that this Apollo 11 footage can't have been in low Earth orbit is if you look at any piece of footage that was taken in low Earth orbit, we can see because the spacecrafts are so close to Earth, they're moving very quickly above its surface, and so the clouds are constantly moving past the camera. The Apollo 9 EVA actually gives us a perfect demonstration of exactly how the Earth would look if we were looking at it through a circular cutout window from low Earth orbit. And it looks nothing like the Earth we see in Apollo 11's broadcasts. In that broadcast, we see an uninterrupted view of the Earth for the best part of 10 minutes, and the clouds don't change. At the end of that broadcast, some 20 minutes later, they then go back to the window and view the Earth again, and not only are the clouds all still in the same position, the whole Earth has rotated slightly. I'll just put that in to cover off any potential claims that they're just shooting a photo of the Earth stuck to the window. However, amongst the unplanned broadcasts, there were other ones that Bart doesn't reference. One, for example, which took place at 30 hours and 28 minutes into the mission, a few hours prior to the broadcasts that Bart does refer to. In this broadcast, we can see that all of the windows are uncovered, so there's a lot of light getting into the cabin, and that they again show a view of the Earth out of the window, but this time the window frame is clearly visible. It's not circular and it's got no cutouts in place. The camera is clearly right next to it rather than on the other side of the craft, and the Earth is not filling up the window, which it would be doing if they were in low Earth orbit, making it blindingly obvious that this footage can't have possibly have been in low Earth orbit and instead must have been thousands of miles away, which would put them beyond the Van Allen belts. That destroys the linchpin of Bart's whole argument, because all his focus is that the moon landings must have been faked because they couldn't physically go beyond the Van Allen belts.
I do not understand how this claim could have convinced anybody, but thanks to Dave's patience, he proves that the Earth in the Apollo 11 footage actually rotates, and it keeps its actual cloud formation. So I guess at the end of the day, we should say thank you to Bart Sibrel for getting people to look a bit closer to prove to us all that Apollo 11 really did fly to the moon. Thanks, Bart. So I don't know, to me it's kind of funny that the guy who started all of this, Bill Casing, told Bart in a video that he got this idea from a homeless heroin addict to undermine the government. And then Bart has gone out of his way to copyright strike all of those clips so nobody can really see that. But then also says that his number one piece of proof that the Apollo missions were faked proves that they were real. Oh my fucking god. Anyway, reason number 9, it's just basically a little bit of proof that these moon landing deniers don't do any research, have no idea what they're talking about, and have no evidence. So since we're on the topic of Bart again, he says this in almost all of the podcasts he appears on.
Practice taking off on one of those things, or could they?
I don't think they
because
did.
they couldn't, right? Because it wouldn't have the same amount of thrust on Earth because the gravity is so much stronger. So that thing wouldn't have been operational on Earth, right?
Well, they had a lunar lander simulator that Neil Armstrong almost got killed in 6 weeks beforehand. He couldn't fly it on Earth in the safety of a tried and true environment, and that was 6 weeks.
This may shock you, but this is not true. You can double check this information for yourself, which is what you should be doing all the time anyway. But Neil Armstrong almost died in training on May 6th, 1968. That is more than a year before the Apollo 11 landing. But anyway, what happened to Neil was a sudden, unexpected loss of helium pressure, which caused the depletion of the hydrogen peroxide propellant needed for the altitude thrusters, which naturally caused the lunar landing research vehicle to go out of control. At approximately 200 feet above the ground, Neil was forced to eject. Thank God he wasn't just a fucking Hollywood actor, and he was actually a trained military test pilot and an astronaut, so he was able to save his own life. And that's pretty badass. So Sir Neil Armstrong gets the pap of approval. But Bart Sibrel, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. This guy says that Neil Armstrong used to be the life of the party. He was extroverted, people always wanted to be around him at parties and shit because he played the piano, he was charming, and it just kind of sounds like Bart Sibrel had a crush on him.
Yeah, you would just think being the first man to walk on the moon, you would almost be pushed more into the public spotlight, you know, because
he was shy. He really was.
After he returned, he became shy.
Right.
After what?
After he returned.
The people I interviewed said he was the opposite.
Beforehand.
Very gregarious person, life of the party. He played the piano. Everyone surrounded him at all parties.
I never remember him like that.
No. Did you spend a lot of time with him beforehand?
He was, forgot what, I was involved in Apollo 8, Apollo 9, no, not 9, 8, 10, 11. Okay, so those crews, and then I was back up on 13 and then flew on 16. So I was, I got to know him, and And Buzz was a different, walked to a different drum. I thought Neil was very shy, but very competent. He had a tremendous background in test pilot experience when he was at Edwards Air Force Base. And he was just really sharp. And but he was an all-shucks kind of guy.
Now, when Bart mentioned that to Sir Charlie Duke, Sir Charlie said, "I've never known Neil to be the life of the party. I knew him to be quite shy." And again, it was not his choice to be the first man on the moon. It just happened that way.
Anybody could have been first on the moon, basically. And, he was just scheduled to be on Apollo 11. So that put him first on the moon. Buzz Aldrin wanted to swap places with him, so Buzz was the first on the moon. And,
oh, really?
Yeah, but he didn't do it. And the hatch, Neil was on the left side, and the hatch was underneath the computer, the instrument panel in the center, and the hatch opened towards the lunar module pilot. So the guy on that left side had to get out first.
That was it.
That was it. Just the way the hatch swung open.
Wow. Bart then says something to the effect of, "I have a friend at NASA and he said Neil changed after Apollo 11 because he hated lying to the world." Dude, are you smoking your fucking socks or something? Here is a guy who worked with Neil and you're trying to tell him about a guy you never met. And then this guy also says, "Why would a NASA astronaut lie?"
Right? Why would a NASA astronaut lie?
Fuck off, will you?
Fuck off!
Thank you, Sir Gordon Ramsay. My God, I'm just giving out paps of approval like they give out writing jobs at Marvel. Anyway, last reason. Reason number 10. Why did they never go back?
Money!
The Apollo project cost more than $250 billion in today's money. And after the US achieved JFK's goal, put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth, and they won the race, and they learned that the Russians, the Soviets, were not trying to get to the moon, they cancelled the program. They then started using that money for other shit. It's an extraordinary amount of money to send people to the moon for only a couple of hours. And if NASA wanted to continue doing that, you need to understand that NASA went from getting almost 5% of the federal budget to less than 1%. That is a major cut in funding. And the green codes, they just say, why don't they just do it again today and prove that they could do it? Well, because you'd probably just say it's fake again. That's actually not true. The truth is that NASA does not give a fuck about what you think. But green coats also like to bring up the fact that NASA themselves said that they destroyed the technology.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
Now, I'm pretty sure that that's just a matter of semantics, but what they actually did was dismantle and repurpose a lot of the parts because they lost a lot of funding. But hey, if you want to see the actual Apollo 11 command and service module that came back to Earth, you can. You can go to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. and see it with your own eyes. That was never destroyed, but since the Saturn V rocket was a 3-stage rocket and it jettisoned dead weight during its journey, of course a lot of the parts are lost. Some of them are on the ocean floors, some of them are still in space, and some of them are on the fucking moon. You can even see the things on the moon with the Chandrayaan satellite images. But they destroyed the technology. So at least NASA admits that they had it. But NASA didn't do it all by themselves. Do you remember the 20,000 industrial firms that they contracted to help build parts for the rockets and space shuttles? Well, many of those companies are closed down now, and many of the parts for the rockets and space shuttle were hand-built by people who can either no longer build them because they're dead or just don't have the physical capability to anymore, or the machines that were built to build these parts are no longer around because these companies went out of business. NASA have said that they can rebuild these things, it's just going to be a painful process. Because there were so many people involved with this, how is this so hard to understand? The blueprints even are still available, of course with a couple of redactions because these are effectively warheads, and putting the formulas for ICBMs online is pretty dumb. But some people have taken these blueprints and they've used them, for example, to rebuild the command and service module to prove that 3 astronauts could really fit inside there. They've used the blueprints to do the maths and the calculations on these rockets. And everything always checks out. All of the evidence points to people walking on the moon. But since I'm in the mood to throw one more punch, people like to point out that NASA lost some of the original footage. And that fact is considered for some reason to be one of the best pieces of evidence that the moon landings were faked. Because they didn't want people to see the footage, I guess, even though they broadcast it to 600 million people live. All of these fucking videos are still on the internet, but they trashed... Oh my god, this is so fucking dumb, I can't even speak at the moment. They trashed the recordings because they faked the moon landings that they've shown everybody. Please, make it make sense. Like I was trying to say, before I had a fucking brain aneurysm, all of the video footage is still available for viewing. Hundreds of hours of footage. But what these green coats are talking about specifically seems to be the telemetry tapes. Now please excuse the shit out of my goddamn French, but what the fuck is a telemetry tape? Well, they are the 14-track analog magnetic data recordings of Apollo. Like that's gonna help, but they contain raw, slow-scan television signals, biomedical data, and spacecraft telemetry. And in case you were wondering, spacecraft telemetry data would include things like temperatures of parts of the spacecraft, and other sciencey data like images from its cameras. Now, these high-quality telemetry backup tapes were recorded at tracking stations at 3 different places in the world. 2 of these places were in Australia when the globe rotated and America was facing away from Apollo, and the other place was in California when America was facing Apollo. However, these were backups, and unfortunately they were just not as high a priority as making sure the astronauts didn't die, or prepping for the subsequent missions, so some of the telemetry tapes did go missing. Emphasis on the word some, because most of the original tapes are actually stored at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. And these original tapes include 2-inch magnetic tape showcasings of the entire missions. There is literally thousands of hours of mission control audio and over 11,000 hours of data to accompany the visual footage. And there is even some original media housed and shown at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. But my question is, what did Bart Sibrel say about all of this?
But we still have the original film.
No,
the
that
16
was
millimeter film is still in Houston at the Johnson Space Center.
Oh, that I don't know.
Of course you had no idea. Now let's address the lost tapes. For this, I'm going to refer to this article on space.com written by Leonard Davies in 2006, so about 20 years ago as of recording this. And yeah, that is a long time ago, but this seems to be what all the green coats are talking about, so that's why I want to read it. So according to space.com, quote, "The first moonwalks by Apollo 11's Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are forever frozen moments in the history books. But it turns out that millions of riveted spectators back on Earth were on the receiving end of substantially degraded television showing the epic event." If you want to read the rest, you can pause the screen, I'm going to skip ahead. Scads of the tapes were produced, and now a search is on to locate them. And if recovered, given a 21st century digital makeover, they could yield a far sharper view of that momentous day, compared to what was broadcast around the globe. But Apollo 11 is a memory rewind, now over 37 years old, 57 years old today. Nobody's quite sure just how much longer the original slow scan tapes will last. That is, if they haven't already been erased. Now a guy named John Sarkisian, his title is on the screen for you to read, said, "I would simply like to clarify that the tapes are not lost as such, which implies that they were badly handled, misplaced, and are now gone forever. That is not the case." Right, so there you have it. The tapes were not lost, on purpose at least. And they've been saying that for 20 years. But since these tapes are so important to the green coats, let's keep going. John Sarkisian went on to say that the tapes were appropriately handled and archived in the mid-1970s after the hectic activity of the Apollo lunar landing era was over. John said, quote, "We are confident that they are stored at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. We just don't know where precisely. It's important to note that there is no inference of wrongdoing, incompetence, or negligence on the part of NASA or its employees. The archiving of the tapes was simply a lower priority during the Apollo era. It should be remembered that at the time, NASA was totally focused on meeting its goal of putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No sooner had they done that, they had to repeat it again a few months later, and then do it again, repeating it for a total of 7 lunar landing missions, including of course Apollo 13, which had to be aborted. So this made it kinda tough to track down the whereabouts of the data, and unfortunately, many of those involved in the archiving of the tapes have since moved on, retired, or passed away. Just like the people who built a lot of the Apollo hardware. Then a guy named Bill Wood, a technical spokesman and a retired Apollo tracking station engineer, came out and said that he wasn't happy with all the reports saying that they are looking for missing Apollo videotapes. Bill had this to say: "That's the furthest thing from the truth. There are no lost Apollo videotapes." Now Bill also mentioned something that I think is quite important. He mentioned, since there was no problem converting the SSTV camera signals from the moon into stuff that can be watched on a TV screen, there was no real need to use the backup telemetry recordings. So when they say they are missing tapes, it must be made clear that all the footage recorded is still out there to watch. It is these backup telemetry tapes that the green coats have a problem with. However, even though they didn't consider these things important, hundreds of boxes of Apollo-era magnetic tape were subsequently shipped to NASA Goddard, later to be likely turned over to the National Record Center in Suitland, Maryland. Most of the Apollo tapes were later returned to NASA Goddard, including the raw Apollo 11 SSTV tapes. However, what happened to the tapes is not known. At least at this time in 2006 it wasn't known. But Bill Wood said that he doubts the tapes would have been trashed, but there is a 50-50 chance that they were recycled. Some of them actually weren't, and I'll tell you about them in just a minute. Now, since telemetry recording tapes back then cost about $90 to $100 a reel, NASA Goddard may have wiped the tapes clean to use them again, which is kinda annoying, but you must remember that these backup tapes weren't seen as important. And NASA was losing a lot of funding, so this was seen as a budget-saving measure. Bill Wood said, quote, "What we're hoping though is that somebody maybe might have saved some of them. We want to interest people to see something better than it happened at the time," end quote. And again, some of them did survive, somebody did save them, and we will talk about these tapes in a minute. But first I want to tell you what a guy named Philip Stuck said. Philip Stuck, an associate professor at the University of Western Ontario, also mentioned that even Russia has misplaced telemetry data of their lunar missions. He said, quote, "I work with people in Moscow who are trying to recover old lunar data too." Wow, so I guess then, if losing backup telemetry tapes is proof that NASA faked the moon landings, then by that same logic, the Soviets must have faked their lunar missions as well. Maybe they even faked Sputnik. Maybe they faked Yuri Gagarin. Maybe they faked Valentina Tereshkova. Maybe they never sent Laika the dog into space because they lost some of their telemetry data. In fact, I think that's a much better thing to deny. I am a Laika denier, because I just don't like what happened to Laika the dog. But unfortunately, just because they lost their telemetry data doesn't mean that they didn't send Laika the dog into space. But as depressed as the story of Laika the dog makes me, there is actually a happy ending here with the Apollo tapes. And this is yet another killing blow to the moon landing deniers. I kind of feel bad about how badly we've shit on this conspiracy theory, but it deserved it. So here's the killing blow. I was reading this article in Ripley's Believe It or Not about how 3 of the missing Apollo 11 tapes were found and then sold at a Sotheby's auction in 2019. Amazing. Some of the original tapes were found. So NASA didn't trash them. But since I'm not sure if Ripley's Believe It or Not is full of shit or not, but they did have a link in their article to another article about the NASA intern Gary George, who had the tapes all this time. So I'm going to read from the article that they linked. It's from the Reno Gazette-Journal because it may help us understand what happened to the lost Apollo tapes. Quote, "In 1973, Gary George was an engineering student at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas, a 90-minute drive from the Houston suburb he called home. Shortly after he enrolled, he landed an internship at the NASA Johnson Space Center. It was there he learned about the General Services Administration auctions used to liquidate government assets that were no longer needed. Gary George said they'd have auctions every couple of weeks, and they included everything from helicopter rotors to copy machines to pickup trucks to cars, and at one of the auctions, there was a tractor trailer half filled with 1,150 film reels. You probably already know where this story is heading. Now, the entrepreneurial side of Gary saw an opportunity here to turn a profit that he could use for spending money at college. He said that there were about 65 reels out of the 1,150 that were the 2-inch type that were used in the 70s by most TV stations. So he's talking about the same 2-inch magnetic tape that would have been used to back up the telemetry data for Apollo. Gary said, quote, "When I saw this stuff out at the auction site, I went back and called around and checked with one of the TV stations. They said that they'd give me $50 a reel for that." Gary then won the bid for the tapes at $217.77. What a fine acquisition that was, but with this purchase came a logistical problem. When Gary paid for it, they said that he would have to remove it in like 3 days. Gary then went out to get a 16-foot closed-in U-Haul trailer, and he goes on to say that they took all the tapes and they basically filled his parents' garage with them and then sold a bunch of them to a TV station. Now, some of the tapes in the collection that he bought, he noticed that NASA had used for storing data, and George saw no use for them. So they actually ended up in the trash on the curb. So soon after dumping that shit on the curb, somebody came a-knocking at the door. Gary's mother then went to answer, and standing there were FBI agents. They then told Gary's mother that somebody had reported to authorities that NASA assets were found in the neighborhood. They then asked Gary how the fuck he got his hands on them, and then he showed the FBI the receipt from the auction, and they fucked off. Does this story require swear words? No, I'm just trying to spice it up. A little while later, after Gary sold a bunch of the tapes, he decided to donate the leftovers to a Texas church that produced a syndicated television show. That way, he could use them as a tax write-off. But very fortunately for him, his father, an accountant named Chet George, helped Gary load the remaining tapes into the family's car. And while doing so, he noticed something. On 3 of the boxes were small little labels identifying the metal reels inside, like this: Apollo 11 EVA, July 20, 1969, Reel 1-3. Now, Chet George was a space nerd, like me, like most people I guess. And he said to Gary, I'd hang on to those if I were you. They might be worth something someday. And holy fucking Moses, was he right. But we'll get there soon. Gary then took the reels out of the pile and put them in a safe place. Then, in 2006, all that news came out about NASA losing the tapes. So after hearing that, Gary contacted a video archivist in California who had equipment capable of playing these vintage videotapes. And then, Gary just assumed that he had backup copies to NASA's original. Eventually though, Gary got in touch with NASA, and the first thing they asked him was, how the fuck did you get your hands on these tapes? Now Gary was clever. He kept the receipt from the auction, so NASA basically said, fair enough, the tapes are yours then. And in 2019, these 3 reels that he had since 1973 were sold at a Sotheby's auction for $1.8 million. And they were sold to, believe it or not, Ripley's. These tapes are now on display in Orlando at Ripley's Believe It or Not's Out of This World gallery. And you won't fucking believe how many attempts it took to say that correctly. So that tells me that my brain is now fucked and I need to wrap this up. So these Apollo 11 tapes, according to Ripley's, are a lot better than the network television broadcast copies. Not only are they among the only surviving first-generation recordings of the Apollo 11 expedition, but their image quality is sharper and more distinct. So there we go. We found some of the tapes and we have a good idea of what probably happened to a lot of them. Therefore, these moon landing deniers can finally shut the fuck up.